Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we shall now begin the interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea, who will present his oral update pursuant to Council Resolution 44/1. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. And I now give the floor to Mr. Mohammed Abdel Salam Babiker. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you. Esteemed Chair, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present my first oral update to the Council since taking up the role of a Special Rapporteur last November 2020. In my update today, I will focus on the human rights of Eritrean refugees and asylum seekers in the context of the ongoing Tigray crisis in Ethiopia, which actually added a new complicated dynamic in the monitoring the human rights of the Eritrean people, and also the progress made in relation to the benchmarks set out in the reports of my predecessor. Since I started my mandate on the 1st of November 2020, I am monitoring the ongoing Tigray conflict in Ethiopia, which erupted on the 4th of November 2020, and its impact on the Eritrean refugees and asylum seekers. There were over 96,000 Eritrean refugees in Tigray before the crisis, living largely in 4 refugee camps, including Hetsats, Meeni, Edi Harush, and Shemelba. I have received information from credible sources that as of November 2020, the situation of these refugees and asylum seekers has become more precarious and worrisome. I also received first-hand accounts of various allegations of grave human rights and humanitarian law violations, including extrajudicial killings, targeted abductions, and forced return of Eritrean refugees and asylum seekers to Eritrea, allegedly by the Eritrean forces. I am particularly concerned about the 2 refugee camps, which hosted over 25,000 Eritrean refugees in Tigray region, particularly Hetsats and Shemelba, and which were allegedly destroyed in attacks carried out by the Eritrean and Ethiopian troops between November 2020 and January 2021, despite their humanitarian status under the 1951 Convention on the Protection of Refugees. I'm also concerned about the allegations of possible implication of the Eritrean troops in cases of serious human rights violations, including acts of abductions, forceful or involuntary return of Eritrean refugees and asylum seekers, and their imprisonment in different prisons inside Eritrea. Such allegations need to be investigated promptly and thoroughly by independent mechanisms. On 20th of January 2021, in my letter to the government of Ethiopia, I called on the Ethiopian authorities to protect the human rights of the Eritrean refugees and asylum seekers in the Tigray region, and to ensure respect for their rights under human rights law, international humanitarian law, and international refugee law. In this oral update, I request the Eritrean authorities to give me full access to refugees and asylum seekers allegedly held in various prisons inside Eritrea. Turning to the issue of the human rights situation in Eritrea since October 2020, I have seen no concrete evidence of progress or actual improvement in the human rights situation in the country. Eritrea has not yet put in place an institutional and legal framework to uphold minimum human rights standards in a democratic society. The country lacks rule of law, a constitution, and an independent judiciary to enforce the protection and respect for human rights. Eritrea continues to have no national assembly to adopt laws, including those regulating fundamental rights and the right of the Eritrean people to participate freely in the public life of their country. On religious freedoms, I welcome the release of a large group of Christians. Reports indicate that in recent weeks, Eritrea has released 70 jailed Christians of evangelical and Orthodox background who were held in 3 prisons. 64 of the Christians had no charge, and some of them were jailed for worshiping in public. On 27 of January 2021, 6 female prisoners detained for worshiping in public in September 2020 in Dekemhari, southeast of Asmara, were also released. On the 1st of February 2021, 21 female and 43 male prisoners were released from Mai, Serwa, and Adi Abitu prisons near Asmara. The prisoners had been held between 2 and 12 years. I also welcome the release on the 4th of December 2020 of 24 Jehovah's Witnesses, including the 3 contentious objectors, Paulo Iyasu, Isaac Mogos, and Nigidi Tiklimariam, who had been held for 26 years. And those cases were highlighted by the former UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea in her statement during the presentation of her report to the Human Rights Council in June 2020, and also in her interactive dialogue with the United Nations General Assembly on 26th of October 2020. While I welcome the release by the authorities of the Christians and Jehovah's Witnesses, I have to note that Eritrea continues to impose restrictions on religious freedoms. I urge the Eritrean authorities to immediately and unconditionally release all those who remain imprisoned because of their faith or belief. I'm turning to the issue of political prisoners and prisoners of conscience. There has been no progress. The situation of detainees and political prisoners is particularly concerning. It is also not acceptable for Eritrea to arbitrarily detain political opponents in secret prisons without charge or trial in violation of human rights standards. For example, since the last report of my predecessor, some prisoners such as David Isaac, a Swedish Eritrean journalist, and 10 of his colleagues remain for 2 decades in incommunicado detention. There are also other examples of numerous cases of individuals who are currently languishing in Eritrean prisons with no prospect of release. It is difficult then to speak of progress in Eritrea while their cases remain unresolved. The practice of arbitrary and incommunicado detentions in Eritrea has serious impact on the life of many Eritreans. In the context of COVID-19, I call on the Eritrean authorities to release those particularly vulnerable, including all the detainees and those who are sick. I also concerned on the impact of the national service on the right to education of Eritrean students. The national service requirements oblige all secondary school students in the country to complete their final year at the Warsai Yekalo Secondary School, located in the Sawa military camp, and undertake mandatory military training for approximately 5 months. I am concerned that the conditions in the camp have impact on the right to education. It is reported that approximately 60 to 65% of students at Sawa do not obtain the results needed for further studies and are either drafted directly into military service or sent to vocational training programs. It is also alleged that military officials in Sawa subject students to ill treatment and harsh punishments, including corporal punishment, and students undertake forced labor. I call on the Eritrean authorities to put an end to such treatment and comply with their international human rights obligations. Finally, since my appointment, I have not yet had the opportunity to meet with the Eritrean officials. On the 18th of December 2020, I requested an invitation to undertake an official visit to Eritrea in my capacity as a special rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea. I propose that I visit Eritrea from 21st to 31st of January 2021 to hold consultations with relevant officials from the government and a range of actors with a view to assessing the human rights situation on the ground and to explore jointly future avenues for constructive engagement for the sake of the protection and promotion of human rights in the country. I have not yet received a response from the Eritrean authorities. I remain willing to engage constructively with the government of Eritrea on urgent human rights concerns. I hope the Eritrean authorities will cooperate with my mandate, and I am still awaiting the response. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And according to our practice, we shall start by hearing the delegation of the country concerned. So I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea. You have 5 minutes.
Let me from the outset congratulate you, Madam President, for assuming the presidency of the Human Rights Council, and my delegation assures you of its full cooperation to the success of your mandate and the work of the Council under your able leadership. Madam Vice President, the Human Rights Council is again confronted with another usual oral report by the new Special Rapporteur on Eritrea, reflecting the same presumptive and offensive allegations that have characterized the annual report since 2012. It is important to recall that the first Human Rights Council resolution against Eritrea was railroaded in 2012 at the peak of the hostility against Eritrea by the same powers and as a fallback position to the unwarranted sanctions imposed under the umbrella of the UN Security Council. To this end, the notorious subversive clique in power in Ethiopia at the time, the TPLF and the Eritrean surrogate groups, it harbored served as the political ill intended to vilify, isolate, and destabilize Eritrea. In the prevailing situation, Eritrea has been treated unfairly and unjustly through this worn out and distorted narrative, and the mandate served this purpose. The special rapporteurs relied exclusively on reports and or innuendos channeled out by the TPLF-dominated Ethiopian government, the minuscule circle of subversive regime change elements in it led and supported a narrow network of Eritrea's arch enemies, including from hostile countries, to continuously indict Eritrea at the Human Rights Council. The present report is another attempt to level the ground by dwelling on the usual vitriol to again portray a bleak picture of Eritrea and demonize the government of Eritrea. The report fails to objectively assess and portray the peace and security challenge posed by the TPLF in the implementation of the 2018 Peace, Friendship and Cooperation Declaration between Eritrea and Ethiopia, with implications to human rights and development. It's unacceptable that the present oral report maintains the essence and position of the previous reports and ignores the continued threats by the criminal clique to undermine the emerging and promising Eritrea-Ethiopia cooperation even after being removed from power. Moreover, its reckless effort to compromise Eritrea's national security through the continued occupation of its sovereign territories in defiance to international decision, its right to live in peace without any threats, and the right to development continued as existential threats that have always been ignored by the mandate. Despite the concrete facts of reality underlined above, the recent futile campaigns to scapegoat Eritrea on the pretext of the rule of law operations successfully undertaken by the Federal Democratic Government of Ethiopia on the TPLF criminal group is a desperate stance that deserves critical attention. In this regard, the futile attempt to tarnish Eritrea's image through the usual culprits and their senseless allegations orchestrated by the defeated TPLF group, its handlers and its diaspora stooges has become a reminiscence of the usual pattern intended to give life to the decadent group. This is a historic betrayal to the ongoing effort of genuine peace, security, and development in the Horn of Africa, as well as an outright denial of the unparalleled damage the group created during its 27 years on Ethiopia, Eritrea, and as a spoiler in the region, which is unacceptable. Madam President, in the context of the prevailing situation and dynamics outlined above, Eritrea is better placed to funnel all its material and human capital towards meaningful and sustainable development. The track record of the past 29 years illustrates that Eritrea has and can achieve inclusive and rapid economic growth predicated on social justice, promotion of equal rights and opportunities sanctioned by national law, and focusing on the human dignity, betterment of life and development under conducive conditions of internal and regional peace. A central dimension in this respect is the ongoing effort at mainstreaming human rights in the nation-building process. In this regard, removal of existential threats will eliminate once and for all the diversion of much-needed resources to defense. As it happens, Eritrea's ambitious programs of development are being recalibrated and pursued within this positive mindset and energy. The fruits of this purposeful and resolute endeavor will surely be reaped in the years ahead. In the above context, and to conclude, Madam President, it is high time for the Human Rights Council to break with the unproductive approach inertia through terminating the mandate imposed on Eritrea for the last 8 years, and end the unwarranted ritual of annual harassment of Eritrea. On its part, Eritrea will continue to expand and consolidate dignified engagement and international cooperation based on partnership, continue its modest contribution to raise the efficiency and effectiveness of the Council, and work together with other members to depoliticize the Council and its agendas. I thank you. Stay safe, stable, and strong.
Thank you. And I would like to inform you that the list of speakers is now closed. I now invite interested delegations to ask questions to the Special Rapporteur and to make comments on his oral update. And I first give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union by video.
The EU thanks the Special Rapporteur and reaffirms its support to his mandate. The human rights situation in Eritrea continues to be a cause for serious concern. The EU remains deeply concerned about the continued practice of indefinite national service, arbitrary detention and forced disappearances, as well as the severe restrictions on the exercise of freedom of expression, freedom of religion of belief, and the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. While we note reports that Eritrea released prisoners belonging to different religions, the EU calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all those detained arbitrarily, including political prisoners, journalists, and human rights defenders. The EU urges the government to implement a constitutional, legal, and institutional framework for the promotion and protection of human rights for land and property rights, including those of foreign communities, and to address all forms of gender-based violence. The EU is deeply worried about the involvement of Eritrean military forces in the conflict in Tigray. It is imperative to allow independent experts to investigate all violations and abuses and ensure that those responsible are brought to justice. All parties are expected to ensure full cooperation with these investigations. The EU calls on the government to immediately withdraw its forces from Ethiopia and to respect applicable international laws. We call upon Eritrea to cooperate with the Special Rapporteur and grant him full and unhindered access. The EU remains ready to support Eritrea in this endeavor. Dr. Babiker, how can the international community best assist you in monitoring the human rights situation in Eritrea and of Eritrean refugees in the region?
I thank you, and I give the floor to Denmark on behalf of the Nordic-Baltic countries.
I have the honor of speaking on behalf of the Nordic-Baltic countries. We would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for his update. We are deeply concerned about Eritrean forces in Tigray and reported serious human rights violations in the region committed against civilians and Eritrean refugees, including arbitrary killings, SGBV, and forced returns of refugees. We call for the immediate withdrawal of all Eritrean forces from Tigray. We remain concerned about human rights violations and abuses in Eritrea, including the indefinite national service, arbitrary detention, inhumane prison conditions, and restrictions on freedom of expression and religion or belief. We call upon the government to ensure the respect for all human rights. Finally, we urge the government to strengthen its engagement with the Council's mechanisms, including by granting the Special Rapporteurs full access to the country. How can the causes of the conflict in Tigray and the dire humanitarian crisis best be addressed, taking into account the serious human rights violations and abuses? I thank you.
I thank you, and I give the floor to Germany.
Thank you, Madam President. Germany aligns itself with the EU statement. We welcome the new Special Rapporteur, Mr. Babiker, to the Council. We followed your predecessor's work closely and wish you all the best for your work in this important mandate. We hope that the Eritrean government will welcome you in a cooperative spirit and that it will increase its cooperation with OHCHR, United Nations human rights mechanisms in general, and special procedure mandate holders in particular. The last report from Mrs. Kravitz was unmistakably clear. The Special Rapporteur has seen no evidence of a tangible improvement in the human rights situation. She remained deeply concerned by widespread human rights violations. Furthermore, she noted that there has been no progress on the issue of political prisoners, prisoners of conscience, or persons otherwise unlawfully and arbitrarily detained. In addition to this, there are numerous reports of serious violations of human rights perpetrated by Eritrean troops in Tigray. These include the forced repatriation or refoulement and possibly the subsequent detention of Eritrean refugees. The findings by Mrs. Kravitz, as well as the reports on Tigray, are deeply concerning. How do you assess the developments since you assumed the mandate? Thank you, Madam President.
I thank you, and I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, President. We believe that human rights issues in individual countries should be addressed by the authorities there independently. The international community should render any assistance it can in doing this, moreover, exclusively with the consent of the relevant states. Sadly, consideration of the Eritrea dossier does not meet these criteria. It is of a prejudiced partisan character. We want to stress that the Council is a mechanism of international cooperation in the field of human rights. Its equitable, mutually respecting, constructive interaction should make up its work. In that regard, we believe that we call on states to refrain from politicising human rights situations in Eritrea and to stop exploiting it as a pretext for interference in internal affairs of this sovereign state. For its part, we welcome the efforts of the Eritrean authorities to forge good, constructive relations with its neighbours, to build cooperation within the region and at international level. We note steps geared towards strengthening at national level the regime for promoting and protecting human rights. We trust that the authorities will strive to comply with these unconditionally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And next on the list is France. France, you have the floor. France, vous avez la parole.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, President. France aligns with the statement by the EU. I thank the Special Rapporteur for his briefing on the human rights situation in Eritrea and reiterate the support of France to his work. France shares the concerns of the Rapporteur. Since publication of the last human rights report on Eritrea in May 2020, the situation has seen no improvement. France remains troubled by the continued repression of political opposition, of journalists, human rights defenders, victims of enforced disappearance, arbitrary arrest, often in appalling detention conditions, often in secret. We call on the Eritrean authorities to put an end to indefinite national service, which has continued even while the country has taken drastic confinement measures in the context of the current pandemic. Moreover, allegations of human rights atrocities committed by the authorities in the Tigray region, in the Ethiopian region of Tigray, are particularly troubling. While Eritrea is an elected member of this council, the authorities have shown no willingness to cooperate with the international human rights follow-up mechanisms, particularly with the Special Rapporteur. In these conditions, France will continue to advocate that the human rights situation in Eritrea should continue to be subject of regular follow-up in this Council. Thank you.
Je vous remercie, and I give the floor to Australia.
Thank you, Vice President. Australia thanks the Special Rapporteur for his oral update. We affirm our support for the mandate of the Special Rapporteur and urge the government of Eritrea to cooperate fully with this mandate. We are concerned by reports of Eritrea's involvement in the conflict in Tigray and associated allegations of human rights abuses and forced returns of Eritrean refugees. We call on Eritrea to investigate all claims of refoulement and abuses of human rights committed by its troops in the conflict region. Australia remains concerned by ongoing reports of forced labour and prolonged compulsory national service. We call on Eritrea to introduce legislation that prohibits the use of forced labour, applies reasonable time limits for national service, and provides options for conscientious objection. While we welcome reports regarding the recent release of prisoners, many of whom were detained without charge or trial for practicing their faith, restrictions on freedom of religion or belief, as well as the arbitrary arrest and detention of members of non-recognised religions, continue to be of concern. We call on the government of Eritrea to fully respect the freedom of religion or belief of all Eritreans. We asked Dr. Babiker if he could provide an update on Eritrea's progress in implementing the 131 Universal Periodic Review recommendations it accepted and against the benchmarks identified by the former Special Rapporteur. Thank you.
I thank you very much, and we'll continue with Switzerland.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, Switzerland thanks the Special Rapporteur for his briefing. Switzerland remains concerned by the human rights situation in Eritrea, exacerbated by COVID-19. While it is in the third year of its mandate in the Human Rights Council, we urge Eritrea to cooperate fully with the Council and its mechanisms to improve the human rights situation in the country. Switzerland encourages the Eritrean government to invite the Special Rapporteur to carry out a visit and to improve access for international organisations and diplomatic missions throughout the country. Reports on releases of individuals belonging to religious minorities arbitrarily detained we welcome this. However, it remains hard to obtain reliable information due to a lack of access to the country. Switzerland is concerned that a large number of detainees remain in detention without trial or without any accusation against them. With the eruption of the armed conflict in the region of Tigray in the north of Ethiopia, as well as the spike in inter-community and inter-ethnic violence in Sudan, the humanitarian and security situation in the Horn of Africa is more volatile and fragile than ever. Now, Mr. Rapporteur, how do you judge the impact of these regional developments on the human rights situation in Eritrea, and what information do you have on the human rights situation of Eritrean population displaced in neighbouring countries? Thank you.
Much, and we'll continue with Venezuela.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you. President, Venezuela does not support specific country initiatives in countries of the South in this Council. Those mandates, when established, often don't have the consent of the country concerned. Eritrea actively cooperated with this Council and its mechanisms, providing information on its efforts to promote and protect human rights of its people. So the country successfully carried out its UPR. The UN should provide assistance to the country to help implement obligations undertaken in the UPR, which is the ideal mechanism for addressing human rights issues on an equal footing between states. Country mandates undermine the principle of respect for sovereignty and non-interference in internal affairs of states enshrined in the Charter. We reiterate again the vital need for the Council to comply with its mandate and promote and protect human rights based on genuine cooperative dialogue, which are the key pillars of its work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we'll continue with the Netherlands. Madam High Commissioner, the Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement and would like to add the following remarks in a national capacity. We thank the Special Rapporteur, Dr. Babiker, for his oral update and reaffirm our full support for his mandate. We share your concerns on the human rights situation in Eritrea, Eritrean involvement in the Tigray crisis, and the situation of Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia. In the summer of 2018, we hoped that the improved relations between Eritrea and Ethiopia would be the start of a new era, one of peace and cooperation. Unfortunately, the crisis in Tigray and reports of grave human rights violations, including rape as a weapon of war, have shown us the opposite. We are deeply worried about continued violations of the rights and freedoms of Eritrean citizens by the government of Eritrea. We are particularly concerned about the continued practice of indefinite national service, the practice of arbitrary detention and forced disappearances, religious persecution, and the severe restrictions placed on basic human rights and freedoms, such as the freedom of expression and assembly. We urge Eritrea to respect freedoms and rights of its citizens and to cooperate with and allow access to the Special Rapporteur and other human rights mechanisms. Dr. Babiker, how can we best assist you to fulfill your mandate? I thank you. I thank you, and we'll continue with the Democratic Republic of Korea. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
The times of unconstructive, counterproductive, and even demeaning documents, thereby damaging the credibility of human rights mechanism as a whole. We are of the view that any debate based on prejudice and aimed at political objective is not conducive but counterproductive to the genuine promotion and protection of human rights, and therefore such practice should be discontinued. The genuine willingness and preparedness of the government of Eritrea for the promotion and protection of human rights and efforts to that end should be duly taken into account and further encouraged. The HCRC and OHCHR should avoid application of politicization, selectivity, and double standards in the fields of human rights and encourage the constructive dialogue and cooperation to promote understanding of the different realities and to explore effective ways for the promotion and protection of human rights. I thank you.
I thank you, and I give the floor to Belgium.
Madam President, Belgium congratulates Dr. Babiker with his appointment and thank him for his oral presentation. Fully adhering to the EU statement, Belgium regrets that the human rights situation in Eritrea hardly shows any sign of improvement. The exercise of fundamental freedom, notably those of peaceful assembly and association, of expression and of religion or belief, remain in jeopardy for Eritreans across the board. The sustained practice of indefinite national service, as well as instances of arbitrary detention and enforced disappearance, continue to be reasons of serious concern. Regrettably, these issues are compounded by a worrying involvement of Eritrean armed forces in major human rights violations across the border in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. While the protection status of refugees and the principle of non-refoulement should all be sacrosanct, we received especially disturbing reports in that regard about the treatment of Eritrean refugees in the Shimelba and Hitsats camps. We call for an independent and impartial investigation and ensuring accountability for these crimes, as well as for an immediate withdrawal of Eritrean forces from Ethiopia. As a member of this Council, Eritrea has special responsibilities. Cooperation with the newly appointed Special Rapporteur would be a welcome step in that respect.
Thank you very much, and I'll give the floor to the United States of America.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak here today. The United States remains deeply concerned by Eritrean troops in Ethiopia's Tigray region and by credible reports that they are committing grave human rights abuses and forcibly returning Eritrean refugees to Eritrea. We urge Eritrea to withdraw its troops immediately from Ethiopia's Tigray region and to investigate and hold accountable those responsible for human rights abuses. While we welcome the release of imprisoned members of religious groups, we are troubled that the government has prevented many religious groups from legally registering, and their numbers are penalized for exercising their faith. We remain concerned by reports of indefinite and arbitrary detention, particularly of individuals arrested for exercising freedoms of expression, religion, or belief, or the right to peaceful assembly. We urge the government to reinstate the 18-month national service limit and provide alternatives for conscientious objectors. Our question is the following. Does the Eritrean military have sufficient control over its troops to prevent them from committing human rights abuses? Thank you.
I thank you, and I give the floor to Spain.
Thank you. Spain aligns with a statement by the EU and thanks the rapporteur for the oral update. We condemn the ongoing grave human rights violations, including indefinite arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance and persistent forms of gender-based violence, as well as severe restrictions on political rights, freedom of expression, of opinion and religion. Spain calls on Eritrea to undertake necessary reforms to put an end to indefinite military service, which includes acts of torture, sexual violence, gender-based violence and labour exploitation of recruits, and cooperate with the UN mechanisms in order to further improve the human rights situation and build a rule of law. Finally, we call on all parties to the conflict in Tigray to respect international human rights law and international humanitarian law, including the rights of Eritrean refugees in Tigray to a voluntary safe return. Rapporteur, what credibility do reports of abductions, assassinations and enforced returns of Eritrean refugees in Tigray to Eritrea have? How credible are they? Thank you.
Very much.
Madam Chair, China appreciates Eritrea's commitments to promote and protect human rights. It positively evaluates Eritrea's achievements such as promoting sustainable economic and social development, eliminating poverty, strengthening the social security system, and safeguarding the rights of vulnerable groups such as women, children, and disabled. We understand the challenge faced by Eritrea as a developing country and call on the international community to provide constructive assistance to the government. And China always advocates addressing differences in the field of human rights through constructive dialogue and cooperation, and it opposes the use of human rights as a political tool and setting up country-specific mechanisms without the consent of the countries concerned. We've noticed that Eritrea and countries in the region oppose the Council maintaining a special rapporteur on the human rights situation in the country. We call on the Council to terminate this country-specific mechanism. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, and I'll give the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. First of all, we'd like to confirm that Belarus does not support the adoption of country resolutions and creating country mandates without consent of the government of the state concerned. We continue to reiterate that country initiatives and mandates are not long-term effective solutions. What's more, we do not think that country mandates are entirely independent, or that information for reports is collected on the basis of dubious methodology. We don't think it's objective. The absence of trust in this institute, above all by effective states, leaves us no doubt as to the mechanism's futility. The issue of human rights in Eritrea is being discussed in the Human Rights Council one session in, session out. Such excessive attention to this issue highlights its politicized nature. We note that Netherlands, Australia, Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, as the main authors of Resolution 44.1 on Eritrea themselves, are figured in the summaries of concerns of the human rights mechanisms. We stress the need for equitable treatment for all states. Therefore, we reiterate that the Council must rethink its attitude towards the role of country mandates, including towards Eritrea. Thank you.
And I give the floor to Austria.
Thank you very much. Austria aligns itself with the statement by the EU. I would like to congratulate Dr. Babica for his appointment and reaffirm my country's full support to his mandate. While we welcome the release of prisoners belonging to different religions, we are concerned by the continuing practice of arbitrary arrests and detentions, as well as reports of torture. We call on the government of Eritrea to implement comprehensive reforms to the criminal justice system to ensure that it is transparent, fair, and equitable. We also remain concerned about the continued practice of indefinite national service and the absence of basic freedoms, such as the freedom of expression, the freedom of assembly, which have forced thousands of Eritreans to flee their country. We deplore that Eritrea keeps squandering opportunities to achieve progress in the field of human rights. As a member of this Council, Eritrea has a special duty to uphold the highest human rights standards and to fully cooperate with the Council, its mechanisms, and the OHCHR. Finally, we're alarmed about the presence of Eritrean military forces in the Ethiopian province of Tigray and credible reports of severe human rights violations. We join the call for the immediate withdrawal of Eritrean troops from Ethiopia. Thank you.
I thank you. And next on our list is the Philippines.
Thank you, Chair. Over the years, we have seen the inherent challenges that have accompanied country-specific human rights mandates. Many existing mechanisms, including those in Eritrea, do not have the buy-in of the country concerned and struggle to piece together an objective and truthful picture of the situation on the ground. It is concerning that while the integrity of OHCHR's and mandate holders' reports demand data and information of the highest unimpeachable quality, a large number of outputs have had to rely on anecdotal and indirect evidence. This is a result of a process that has fallen short in ensuring full participation, inclusivity, and constructive engagement, especially as it concerns the states that have been put under scrutiny, oftentimes under vigorous objections. Mandates that do not have the cooperation of the states concerned will always be self-perpetuating exercises that create very little impact where it matters most, on the ground. We urge the OHCHR and mandate holders to actively re-examine their strategies, identify the mechanisms that have proven costly and ineffective, and rededicate time and resources to promote more constructive and more holistic forms of human rights engagement. Thank you.
I thank you, and I give the floor to Ethiopia.
We would like to take note of the oral update of the Special Rapporteur, Mr. Mohammed Abdusalam Babakar, on the situation of human rights in Eritrea. We appreciate Eritrea's efforts in engaging the global and regional human rights systems through fulfilling its periodic reporting obligations. We also commend the government of Eritrea for its measures towards the betterment of the socio-economic rights of its citizens. In particular, the preventive approach in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic enabled Eritrea to be one of the few countries in the world with the lowest infection and fatality rates. Protection and promotion of human rights are best defined as requiring a continuous exercise. Therefore, activities aiming at the protection of human rights shall comprise a constructive engagement and availing a tailor-made support and capacity-building measures on priority areas that are defined in close collaboration with the country concerned. I thank you.
I thank you very much, and I give the floor to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
The United Kingdom welcomes Dr. Babika to the role of Special Rapporteur for the situation of human rights in Eritrea, and we fully support all efforts to fulfil his mandate. The UK is concerned by the involvement of Eritrean forces in Tigray and reported human rights violations and abuses by all those involved in the conflict. We call for the withdrawal of Eritrean forces and urge all parties to bring an end to the fighting. We also call for independent international investigations into allegations of human rights abuses and violations, to ensure that perpetrators of proven allegations are held to account and to gain justice for victims. We welcome news of the release of religious worshippers during 2020. However, we remain concerned that many worshippers are still subject to arbitrary detention. We urge Eritrea to release all those being arbitrarily detained and to progress with national service reform. The UK also encourages progress on Eritrea's implementation of the recommendations from its last Universal Periodic Review. And we call on the government to share their plans for doing this at the earliest opportunity. Finally, how does the Special Rapporteur intend to use his mandate to influence Eritrea's trajectory on human rights?
I thank you, and I give the floor to South Sudan.
Would like to thank the rapporteur on the oral update on Eritrea and commend the progress made so far by the Eritrean government with regards to its human rights situation. The government of Eritrea implements a national development program aimed at accelerating socio-economic progress, consolidating rule of law, and strengthening national institutions. Madam Vice President, in light of this progress made in Eritrea, South Sudan supports this progress and calls on the international community to recognize efforts made by the Eritrean government, in particular to its efforts in consolidating institutional and legal frameworks, including the modest achievements in areas of administration, of justice promotion, and economic, social, and cultural rights, empowerment of women and child rights and disabilities. I thank you.
I thank you. And next on our list is Ireland.
Ireland aligns with the EU statement and thanks the Special Rapporteur for bringing these important issues to the Council's attention. We are deeply troubled by Eritrea's lack of compliance with its international human rights obligations. Over 5 years since the Commission of Inquiry's finding in 2016, including that crimes against humanity had been committed in Eritrean detention facilities, military training camps and other locations, there has been minimal progress towards reform. Arbitrary arrests and incommunicado detention remain common. Practices associated with the national service continue to violate basic standards, and there is little space for independent civil society to operate. In this regard, we are extremely concerned by allegations that Eritrean forces have committed widespread violations of international humanitarian, human rights and refugee law in the Tigray region of Ethiopia since November 2020. These allegations include killing of civilians, sexual violence, looting and preventing humanitarian access to people in need, contributing to immense food insecurity. We call on Eritrea to urgently comply with its obligations under international law, including those related to the protection of civilians, the prevention of sexual and gender-based violence, and the rights of refugees. We also urge Eritrea to cooperate fully with your mandate and OHCHR. Special Rapporteur, have you witnessed any progress in Eritrea's implementation of its UPR recommendations? Thank you.
I thank you very much, and I now give the floor to Sri Lanka.
Madam President, Sri Lanka wishes to express concern over the continuing discriminatory practice of the selective adoption of country-specific initiatives in the Human Rights Council. We are of the view that country-specific initiatives are confrontational, counterproductive, and undermine the spirit of cooperation that is required in promoting and protecting human rights, and violate the principles of sovereign equality and non-interference enshrined in the UN Charter. Sri Lanka reiterates that any action aimed at the protection and promotion of human rights in a country must have the consent of the country concerned and be based on the principles of cooperation and genuine dialogue. We believe that the appropriate mechanism to address the human rights situation of all countries in a uniform, objective and constructive manner is the Universal Periodic Review, where countries could meaningfully and effectively contribute to the promotion and protection of human rights without discrimination. In conclusion, we encourage this Council to engage in a positive dialogue with the government of Eritrea. I thank you.
I thank you, and I give the floor to Sudan.
Thank you, Madam President. We would like to welcome the Special Rapporteur, Mr. Babika, and we also welcome the delegation of Eritrea. We have listened to the oral update on the situation of human rights in Eritrea. We would like to emphasize the following. First, we would like to reiterate our firm position regarding the promotion of human rights all over the world. We reaffirm the importance of constructive cooperation between all parties. Two, we would like to draw attention to the fact that we must ensure proper cooperation between national governments and human rights mechanisms in order to promote human rights in Eritrea. Three, we hope that the government of Eritrea will continue to cooperate with the Human Rights Council in order to serve the interests of the Eritrean people in accordance with international instruments. Thank you, Madam.
I thank you very much, and I give the floor to Nicaragua.
Nicaragua, please unmute.
Gracias, señora Vice.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Nicaragua recognizes the valuable efforts of the government of Eritrea in the administration of justice, the promotion of economic, social, and cultural rights, the empowerment of women, the defense of the rights of the child, and the defense of the rights of people with disabilities. All these achievements have been acknowledged by the United Nations and other development partners. We remain convinced that human rights can only be promoted through genuine dialogue and through constructive international cooperation, which is why we believe that reports such as the one presented today on Eritrea, far from promoting the efforts of countries to attain peace and progress, in fact promote ill-intentioned behaviors, and they pursue questionable political interests. We urge that conversations on human rights take place by respecting the commitment of sovereignty of the peoples that are defending their inherent right to choose their own fate, and to take on the constructive commitment to refrain from taking actions and initiatives that promote instabilities in countries that are discussing on ways to settle their own domestic issues. Thank you.
Much, and I now give the floor to Cuba.
Thank you, Madam President. The resolution that mandates this dialogue, which is foreign to the decision of countries in the region, is an attack to the principles that should govern the Human Rights Council. It further contributes to polarization, politicization, and double standards that have been creeping up in this body. The Human Rights Council should not renounce the promotion of cooperation and constructive dialogue, and a respectful dialogue with Eritrea. Cooperation, dialogue, and a respectful exchange of ideas among all countries based on the principles of the United Nations Charter are the path to follow for the promotion and protection of human rights. This shall also be the way in which this Council broaches the matters of concern for the international community by creating a fitting environment for the attainment of all human rights for all. Thank you.
Much, and I give the floor to Djibouti.
Thank you, Chairperson. Djibouti welcomes the Special Rapporteur and thanks him for the oral update. Djibouti hopes that our exchange today will be an opportunity for a constructive dialogue. My government welcomes and remains committed to the peace and reconciliation dynamics in our region and believes that the commitment and engagement of all countries in the region will strengthen the regional integration and should benefit to respective citizens of each and every country. The opportunities created by peace and reconciliation are far-reaching and with no doubt shall positively impact the protection and promotion of human rights and as well as the upholding of humanitarian law. Last year, my delegation updated the Human Rights Council on the fate of the 19 Eritrean prisoners of war under its custody and was pleased to report that they were being resettled as refugees in a third country with the assistance of UNHCR and ICRC. However, Djibouti remains deeply concerned by the lack of information on the 13 remaining Djiboutian prisoners unaccounted for and held incommunicado in Eritrean custody and call on Eritrea to share information on the fate of these prisoners with relevant stakeholders. Djibouti firmly believes that the normalization of relations between Djibouti and Eritrea, if sustained by meaningful and genuine engagement by both sides, shall contribute to solve the issue related to the fate of the Djiboutian prisoners of war. The Special Rapporteur, the OHCR, and the Human Rights Council are encouraged to continue engaging positively with Eritrea. And I thank you.
I thank you, and we shall now turn to the list of speakers for non-governmental organizations. And I first give the floor to the representative of Center for Global Non-Killing.
I deliver this statement on behalf of the Center for Global Non-Killing and Release Eritrea. We thank the Special Rapporteur for his work highlighting human rights violations in Eritrea. The Horn of Africa is plagued by a number of calamities, COVID-19, locust infestations, and now regional war. For the people of Eritrea, this has meant a worsening of the already difficult situation, enduring the strictest lockdown enforced without consideration for their livelihoods or well-being. Children are without education, people have become unemployed, and businesses have suffered, making nearly everyone dependent on handouts from the diaspora. It is unclear how the government is responding to the locust infestation, as there are no verifiable data available. We fear that many may be suffering in silence. Some prisoners of faith were released, and we welcome this. Yet, we call on all prisoners of conscience to be released. The war in Tigray is deeply concerning due to the presence of 100,000 Eritrean refugees who have suffered, as well as the mounting evidence of the involvement of Eritrean soldiers in heinous war crimes, including killing of civilians, rape of women and girls, desecration of historic and religious institutions, and looting of households, health centers, factories, and universities. We call on all international bodies to use their good offices to bring this war to an end. Thank you.
I thank you, and I give the floor to the Eliska Relief Foundation.
Mr. President, Eritrea remains an unsafe place for those who are perceived as critical of the government. Those who dare to express dissent and opinion are arrested and held incommunicado in detention centers, sometimes indefinitely, and subjected to inhumane and degrading treatment and punishment, often without any due process. Elzika Foundation notes that tens of thousands of Eritreans are currently detained without charge or trial in life-threatening conditions in more than 300 sites across the country. The conditions in these facilities are unsanitary and unsatisfactory, and access to food, water, and sanitary products and medical attention is insufficient and often withheld as punishment. These conditions have further been exacerbated by COVID-19 restrictions, which has denied many detainees access to vital food supply and sanitary products, which might have otherwise been provided by their families. Mr. President, the Foundation therefore urges the government of Eritrea to conduct fair trials to all political and religious prisoners who have been indefinitely detained, and effect immediate and unconditional release of any prisoners not charged with any crimes. This decongestion is particularly important in combating the spread of COVID-19 in prisons at this critical time. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you, and I give the floor to the East and Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Project.
Madam President, Mr. Special Rapporteur, we thank you for your update and wish you the best in your new role. Your mandate remains a vital mechanism to monitor and report on Eritrea's human rights situation. This is the last year of Eritrea's membership in the Council, and it is clear that being a member did not defeat international scrutiny. We urge the Eritrean government to move beyond inconsistent, fickle communication streams with the UN human rights system and invite the Special Rapporteur to visit the country to explore avenues for cooperation and reform. We remain deeply concerned over ongoing violations, including the incommunicado detention of journalists and unresolved cases of disappearances and detentions, including that of Siham Ali Ahmed. Since November, there have been independent reports, including by the High Commissioner for Refugees, of Eritrean military involvement in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. Infiltration of armed actors in refugee camps has led to violations of Eritrean refugees' rights, including killings, abductions, and forced return to Eritrea. Refugees must be protected. Elsewhere, as last week in Aksum, reports of egregious violations by Eritrean soldiers have emerged. We urge independent, impartial inquiries into all these violations. Dr. Mohammed, what is your analysis of Eritrea's involvement in Tigray and possible violations of international law? Thank you.
I thank you, and next on the list is Christian Solidarity Worldwide.
Thank you, Madam President. CSW thanks the Special Rapporteur for his oral update and important work. Eritrea's human rights crisis remains acute. We deeply regret the lack of progress towards the 5 benchmarks identified by the mandate and the ongoing non-cooperation with the Rapporteur. CSW shares the Special Rapporteur's concerns regarding continued violations of the right to freedom of religion or belief, which have been ongoing since May 2002. While welcoming recent releases of close to 100 Christians and Jehovah's Witnesses, we note hundreds more remain detained arbitrarily on account of their religious beliefs. Moreover, members of 4 government-sanctioned religious groups also experience repression. The COVID-19 pandemic has increased concerns for the welfare of tens of thousands of prisoners of conscience held in life-threatening, unsanitary conditions, while a lengthy, stringent, pandemic-related lockdown has exacerbated food insecurity. We urge Eritrea to end the practice of arbitrary arrest, incommunicado detention, and indefinite detention without charge or trial, to release all prisoners of conscience without precondition, including the legitimate patriarch of the Orthodox Church, Abune Antonios, and to ease the year-long lockdown. Finally, the involvement of Eritrean troops fighting in Tigray, including young conscripts, and credible reports of forced returns of Eritrean refugees are of grave concern. We call on Eritrea to withdraw all military personnel immediately, and on this Council to mandate an investigation into alleged atrocity crimes in Tigray as a matter of urgency, establishing judicial mechanisms to hold identified perpetrators to account. Thank you.
I thank you, and I give the floor to Reporters Without Borders International.
Madam President, journalism no longer exists in Eritrea since the 2001 crackdown. Independent media outlets have been closed and journalists have been imprisoned or forced into exile. Eritrea remains the largest prison for journalists in sub-Saharan Africa, with at least 11 journalists detained in undignified conditions. Detained Swedish Eritrean journalist Dawit Isaak has never had access to his family or to a lawyer. The last testimony concerning him dates back more than 10 years and revealed he was ill and exposed to terrible heat in a container that served as a cell. For the past 20 years now, Eritrea has continuously and openly mocked the attitude of the international community towards it, and the diplomacy of silence has failed to provide any result. In this regard, the refusal of the Swedish judiciary to open an investigation for crimes against humanity on the ground that it could not be carried out due to the lack of cooperation from the Eritrean authorities is very concerning. RSF urges Eritrea to release all journalists currently detained, to refrain from any persecution or hindrance of the media, and to allow independent media. RSF also urges all the states to demand that Eritrea collaborate with the UN special procedures, ICRC teams, and the international observers in particular to visit the detained journalists. Thank you.
I thank you, and I give the floor to International Fellowship of Reconciliation.
Thank you, Madam President. The International Fellowship of Reconciliation thanks the Special Rapporteur for her oral update. The current situation in the region is dramatic, as reported also from our local partner organizations. Refugee camps under international protection in the Tigray region, including schools, clinics, and residential areas, have been systematically targeted and destroyed with the purpose of hindering their future usage. In particular, the Hisats and Shimelba refugee camps, which hosted refugees coming from Eritrea, have been under attack. UNHCR acknowledges that 20,000 refugees are unaccounted for. Only around 3,000 refugees from Shimelba and Hisats camps found their way to the other 2 refugee camps in the south of Tigray, Mai Aini and Adi Harush, with an estimated 10,000 refueled to Eritrea. UNHCR warns that thousands of Eritrean refugees are still in need of urgent assistance. We restate the concern regarding Eritrean migrants and refugees, who often flee from the system of an indefinite national service, which represents practices that in many cases amount to forced labor. We call on the international community to protect refugees and withdraw from practices which reinforce such a system. Thank you.
I thank you, and I give the floor to Jubilee Campaign.
The Jubilee Campaign and Human Rights Concern Eritrea thanks the Special Rapporteur for his oral update. Eritrea has been in complete lockdown since March 2020. Mass starvation is widespread, yet no financial support or food aid has been supplied by the government. While the rest of the world severely restricted cross-border movements due to COVID-19, tens of thousands of Eritrean troops, including very young conscripts, have been sent to Tigray in Ethiopia and forced to fight a war in which Eritrea's involvement is totally unjustified. The Eritrean regime has been committing crimes against humanity in Eritrea since 1991 and since November 20. Its military has been committing widespread crimes and crimes against humanity in Tigray. The Eritrean military have abducted more than 20,000 Eritrean refugees from 2 refugee camps in Tigray and has burned the camps to the ground. The international community, including this council, should insist that Eritrea withdraws its troops from Tigray immediately, and an independent international inquiry should be created urgently to investigate the Eritrean regime's criminal actions in the region. Thank you.
I thank you, and I now give the floor to International Organization for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination.
Thank you, Madam President. We welcome the oral update by the Special Rapporteur. It is regrettable that the human rights situation in Eritrea has not significantly improved and basic institutional systems are still not in place. We are greatly concerned with arbitrary detentions, enforced disappearances, torture, sexual violence, and the restriction of freedom of expression and association, among other grave human rights violations. These violations only continue to impede Eritreans of their rights to exercise their political and social freedoms, and it further regresses any potential for peace. Furthermore, as in the Special Rapporteur's latest reports, numerous serious human rights violations are committed through and by international operations, for example, trafficking of women and girls. In light of this situation, EFORD and Geneva International Center for Justice strongly urges the international community and the East African community to take all necessary measures in accordance with international law towards ending direct or indirect funding of specific groups who threaten the lives of innocent civilians. Madam President, there is a great need to address humanitarian and climate disasters that exacerbates the plight of many, especially children, who suffer waterborne diseases and other malnutrition and micronutrient deficiencies. Finally, we would like to ask the Special Rapporteur, going beyond legislation, what steps need to be taken in order to involve women in the decision-making processes, particularly in regards to ending gender-based violence against women and girls, and especially those in detention. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank you, and I give the floor to Civicus, World Alliance for Citizen Participation.
Civicus and the Eritrean Movement for Democracy and Human Rights welcome the Special Rapporteur's update and look forward to our future engagement with the mandate. We are alarmed that the human rights situation in Eritrea continues to be dire despite engagement with regional and international actors. Restrictions on civic space remain in force with no free and independent press. At least 16 journalists remain in detention without trial for about 2 decades. We are seriously concerned by the culture of impunity for perpetrators of human rights violations and abuses who continue to conscript Eritreans indefinitely into the military and who detain scores of government critics without trial. Torture and forced labor and sexual violence remain rife with widespread religious and ethnic minority oppression. We call upon the government of Eritrea to cooperate with council mechanisms to create a safe and enabling environment for human rights defenders, journalists, and members of the political opposition to release journalists, civil society activists, and illegally detained Eritreans from prison and cease the forceful roundup of young people for conscription. Special Rapporteur, what are your priorities for your time in this mandate, and what more can the Council do to ensure steps are taken towards accountability and real change on the ground? Thank you.
I thank you, and I give the floor to Advocates for Human Rights.
Madam President, the Advocates for Human Rights welcomes the oral update by the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea. We share concerns about continuing arbitrary arrests and detention, inhumane detention conditions, and the use of torture in detention facilities in Eritrea. The Advocates provides free legal services to asylum seekers in the U.S. Clients who have been forced to flee human rights conditions in Eritrea have shared firsthand accounts that corroborate these ongoing serious violations. Authorities continue to systematically use arbitrary arrest and detention to punish those, including clients of the Advocates, who question or oppose the government. Despite positive developments, including peace with Ethiopia and the lifting of sanctions, the government has failed to reform these practices. Many of those arbitrarily detained over the past decade remain in incommunicado detention, and the government of Eritrea has ignored calls to release such prisoners to relieve overcrowding that is made so much more dangerous by the COVID-19 pandemic. Already harsh conditions inside detention facilities are worsened by COVID-related restrictions that result in detainees being denied access to food and other necessities sent to them by family members. Adding to these concerns are recent reports that the Eritrean military is forcibly repatriating refugees from Tigray, many of whom, like our clients, fled the threat of arbitrary detention and torture and are now being held in unknown conditions. We call on the Human Rights Council to urge Eritrea to release those in arbitrary detention and to continue the mandate of the Special Rapporteur. And we call upon Eritrea to accept the Special Rapporteur's request to conduct a country visit. I thank you.
I thank you. And this was the last speaker on the list. And I now will give the floor to Mr. Babiker for his concluding remarks. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for the questions. In my oral presentation, I actually starting my mandate looking for the Eritrean government to cooperate constructively and engaging with the council. And I think this is a priority related to the performance of this mandate. Historically, the mandate is faced that Eritrea did not give access to special rapporteurs. And I hope and I urge the government of Eritrea to cooperate constructively. I'm really willing to engage with the Eritrean government. And I need to remind the Eritrean government that I came from the region. Sudan was actually, I'm a Sudanese. Sudan was actually under the special rapporteur system and independent expert for almost 20 years. And I honestly believe that we need to engage constructively. There is serious issues. There is a lot of concerns related to detention of political prisoners for more than, as I mentioned in my oral presentation, for more than 20 years. And I think this is, as I mentioned, it is unacceptable for a government to detain political prisoners and also to detain people for because of their faith. And I think this is one of the issues really need to be discussed, as some of the honorable speakers referred to. So the issue of access is really important. There are questions related to what actually my approach toward impacting positively on the trajectory of the human rights situation, as mentioned by many honorable speakers. I believe it is important for the Council and the member states to engage constructively with the government of Eritrea, and I'm ready to lead in this respect, because otherwise there will be a deadlock of improving the situation of human rights. It is key and important for the special rapporteur to get access to the country, to verify the information, and sometimes it is difficult for me as an investigator. I work in many investigations in the region, and it works for the benefit of the Eritrean government that they don't have anything to hide, and then they can open their borders. And then from this platform, I want to start fresh, to genuinely approach my mandate, to constructively engage with the government. So I think members of the Council, of the Human Rights Council, they can actually help me in this perspective. Let me turn to the issue of there are some questions from member states related to the Tigray conflict. Since I started in November, 1st of November, the Tigray conflict erupted on the 4th of November. So this is actually occupied my mandate from the beginning, and shifted the attention in the monitoring of the human rights situation in the country towards the Tigray conflict. And from my investigations, collection of information, meeting witnesses, those actually coming from Ethiopia and from the Tigray region to Sudan over the border, and also credible information indicates that the Eritrean forces are actually operating in the region. And also, I have credible evidence of the destruction of the two camps, Estas and Shemelba. And also I have concrete evidence, which will appear in my next report, related to that the abduction took place from these camps, and also refugees were taken to specific prisons inside Eritrea. I need to get concrete evidence and information related to these, which are actually factual information related to the numbers of those who were abducted and which places they were taken. So I think it is important for Eritrea to cooperate and also to withdraw its forces from the Tigray region. And the same actually goes for Ethiopian government. I'm glad that the Ethiopian representative is here as part of this dialogue, that it has an obligation to protect the refugees, the Eritrean refugees in Tigray region. And this is an international obligation. And in that respect, I wrote a letter to the Ethiopian government, urging them to uphold their obligation to protect the refugees, because there are many more than the two camps completely destroyed, and there are many refugees who are not accounted for. Coming to the last point related to the implication of the Tigray conflict on the region, I think there is a lot of human rights obligations on the government of Eritrea, and also on the Ethiopian government. The influx of refugees to neighboring countries, including Sudan. This will all actually affect the human rights situation in the region. That's related to the benchmarks. I put it of the resolution. I can confidently mention that there is no progress in all these benchmarks, including political prisoners, including freedom of religion, including rule of law. And now there is a new dimension, as I mentioned in my oral presentation, related to the Tigray conflict, which is actually complicating the human rights situation, even extraterritorially, outside Eritrea, related to the protection, which I call Senior Personi, protection of refugees, Eritrean refugees as individuals outside Eritrea. And I think this is a new dimension. I'm going to take it in my next report, outside the benchmarks. I really thank you for all the questions, and I hope to work constructively with the Council and also with the Eritrean government. And I hope that to give attention to my last request to visit the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And this brings us to the end of this interactive dialogue. And I wish to thank Mr. Babiker for his presence here today.